So for those that don't know me, my name is Karen, and I'm going to talk to you about nutrient losses, loads and loadings, which is, I think, fairly topical. But before I do, this talk draws on quite a number of different projects and programs that are going on, so I do need to acknowledge quite a range of people. There are a number of ES staff there, but just a couple I want to pick out is Lisa and Matt, who spent years really working on our land use map and losses, and also Derry NZ, who co-funded some work I'm going to present that NIWA undertook. So I'm just going to start with some key points, but this is also sort of the order that I'm going to present the information in. And probably one of my first key points, sorry, it's showing up here but not there, there we go, is that language matters. And probably for me personally, if I could say something that I've learned over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, is probably that point in science, is that we often underestimate the importance of having a common language. The second component that I'm going to talk about is that understanding losses, loads and loadings are all important. And then the third thing I'll talk to is how our understanding of contaminant sources can vary depending on what we're looking at. So as I said, language is important, so I'm just going to start by explaining the terms as I'm using them today. So as we all know, contaminants can be measured in the landscape in different units and in different places. So today I'm going to use loss to refer to the massive contaminants lost from a given source area over a given time period. So a common measure of loss is like an overseer output. When you total up loss over a given area, say a catchment area, is also often referred to as a source load. A load is the massive contaminants being transported past a given point over a given time. And so generally we tend to talk about in-stream loads. So it's the amount of contaminant moving past a point in a stream over a given time. The difference between the source load and the in-stream load is catchment attenuation. And then the final term is loading. So this is an aerial loading where we refer to the massive contaminants applied or received by an environment of interest over a given area and time frame. So this might be the amount of fertilizer being applied to a given land as a loading, or it might be the amount of nitrogen given to an estuary at an aerial rate. And the reason we use aerial rates is it allows us to compare estuaries of different size. So, Environment Southland has done an extensive amount of work in this space over the last 4 years, both in terms of understanding non-point source or diffuse discharges and point source discharges. And a particular project I want to just mention is the Southland Economic Project that Emma will be talking about later in the day. As part of that project, information was gathered on 95 case study farms, which is an extensive, possibly the most extensive data set of its kind in the country, but also 6 municipal wastewater schemes as well. So we have a wealth of information to draw on when we look at nutrient losses. So as I mentioned before, when we start looking at nutrient losses, one of the first things we look at is land use. So I'm just going to show you a time lapse of land use change in Southland. I'm sure some of you have seen this before, but it's still quite dramatic and quite exciting, even if you have. For those that can't read the, is it going? Wasn't meant to go. So really watch the purple, which is dairying, was the key point. So this is going from 1996 to 2018. So you'll have seen dairy over that time increase by over 300% across the region. For me personally, when we look at some of the land use mapping that's been done, what was surprising, having lived in this region for a long time, was that the total amount of area and agricultural land use has been relatively unchanged over this time period. That most of the land use change we see is a shift from dry stock farming into dairying. So it's really a change in agricultural land use type rather than an expansion of that land area. The second thing I found interesting is that so our region's broken up into 5 freshwater management units, and if we look at the distribution of land use across those units, they're actually quite different. So obviously, the further west we go into Fiordland and the Wyre, conservation and forestry is a predominant feature of the landscape. But the Mataura is still, over half of the land area in the Mataura freshwater management unit is still made up of dry stock farming, compared to the Aridi and Aparima, which has a lot more dairying in it proportionally. So once we have a good handle on the land use maps, we're then able to assign a nitrogen and phosphorus loss to that land use. And I'm not going to go into the details of how we've done this, but it's fairly, I guess, the lookup table concept's fairly common. But the way we have done this is to use a matrix looking at land use, rainfall, slope, soil drainage, and elevation. So looking at combinations of those factors, we can assign a nitrogen and phosphorus loss. And we can do that through time. So just looking over a 20-year time period, so between 1996 and 2016, we can use this information to estimate that nitrogen loss has increased by about 75% in both the Aridi and Aparima FMUs, which is quite a lot. So I just want to move quite quickly into a little bit of a case study now looking at the loadings end. So this is using New River Estuary, which is the estuary beside Invercargill. There's a lot going on in this estuary. There's quite a number of rivers and streams going into it and a couple of point source discharges through Invercargill's old landfill and our wastewater treatment plant. This, as Rachel mentioned earlier, this estuary's got a number of ecological issues as evidenced by those photos showing change at the same site over time. Because of those issues, DairyNZ and Environment Southland commissioned NIWA to do a Delft 3D hydrodynamic model of the estuary that's able to simulate the movement of water, and we can look at how salinity, nutrients and sediment moves through the estuary under the influence of tides, river inflows and winds. Without getting into too much detail, and this report is worth a read, it's really interesting, but the key stats I really want to highlight out of this report, which modelled a typical winter and a typical, or a median winter and a median summer scenario, is that under the summer scenario, Invercargill's wastewater discharge contributed up to 55% of total nitrogen concentrations and 83% of dissolved phosphorus concentrations, with the amount varying depending on where in the estuary you are. I just want to compare that with our loss information that includes our point source discharge information, where only 4%, where the Invercargill wastewater scheme only contributes 4% of total nitrogen and 13% of phosphorus. So even though these aren't quite apples with apples, because one uses river loads that includes catchment attenuation, where this doesn't, there's still quite a huge difference if you're trying to get a handle on where your contaminant sources are coming from. So for phosphorus, comparing 85% to 13%. And I think this is particularly important for limit setting, where we're required to understand contaminant sources as part of our freshwater accounting framework and in that process of setting limits. So just to bring it up to the theme of integration, as I mentioned, I think it's really critical, particularly for limit setting, that we understand losses, loads and loadings if we want to have an understanding of contaminant sources, and that you kind of need all of them to have that integrated picture around where contaminants and when contaminants are coming from. That's it.
Environment Southland.